Blessed sunlight. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. Today's big question is fear. Why do I fear? Am I in danger? Do I feel unsafe? How about you? Do you feel like you're in danger? Do you feel unsafe? What are your fears? Fear of death, fear of change, fear of yourself, fear of God. What is death? And why do we fear death? So let's take a look at that particular question, because it's a question that plagues us. And you see things the way that they are, you come and you realize that the self is real. So the self can never die. Anything that is created inside of the dream is an illusion. So this body is a dream creation to explore the dream world. And because the body is a dream creation, the body only have a set amount of time when it has to be in the dream, in the visible world. When the body can no longer hold the self return back to the invisible world. And so that's really what's happening. You are not dying, because the only reason why you think you're dying, you're thinking that the body is yourself. So that goes on the false self-identification. But are you the body? No, you're not the body. So there is no death. The body is like a vehicle, the car. And so this is what this is. The body is a vehicle that you use to explore this dream world. If you look at the truth, then you see that there is no need to fear. So fear arises out of ignorance, out of not knowing the truth of the world, not knowing the truth of yourself, and when you're using your imagination. So fear of change. Change is inevitable. And so there's changes happening everywhere. You watch yourself. Remember when you were this tiny baby, and look at you now. So we have to remember that change is inevitable. And so right now is coming a time when we have to change. We have to evolve from this duality nature into the non-duality. I know we are afraid of changes, but changes must happen. And so the time has come for change, when we have to transition from the duality back into our true way of being, into the non-duality. So there's no need for fear. Who's fearing? Who's having this fear? The ego. The ego does not want to give up this existence, right? So this is the reason why we have to get to the root and look at our fears. What's the other big fear that we have in the world? The fear of gods. No. Who are the gods, and why do we fear them? Because we have been programmed at a very young age to fear God. Because God said what? He's going to punish us if we don't fear him, and if we don't give them our souls, they're gonna punish us, put us in hell. This is the reason why many people, they have these fears of God and fears of the punishment. But when you come into the real, you understand that God is a dream character. God is not real. God can only exist in the dream, because the real self is sleeping. So the ego arises from the mind, from the consciousness, because the consciousness has tranced the real self in the dream, in the sleep. It does not want it to wake up, because once the real self awake, this ego have no existence. And so the ego does not want to go into extinction. The ego wants to exist forever. And so it has been enslaving and trancing and looping the self in the imagination for ages. And so the time has come for change. There is no need to fear change. Change is inevitable. Just like when we were a baby and we had to grow to be an adult, the same thing is happening right now. We were into ignorance, baby self, and now we have to grow and evolve and develop. The self has to grow. We watch the body grow. Now we have to know that the self has to grow, because the mind has been trancing and enslaving the self for ages. And so now is the time when we have to change. How do you respond to change and to fear? I say the healthy response to fear is to find its root. You have to go to the root of the fear and see what the cause is and to eliminate it. Why do you have these fears? What exactly is fear? And what is at the root of your fear? We have been programmed in fear from the time we were young, the most crippling of all fears, that you must not think for yourself and don't trust your inner intelligence. They have programmed us to trust everything outside of ourselves without trusting our inner wisdom and our inner truth. They say, trust this book, this Bible that was given to us by God. These are the words of God. God is an illusionary character. God is the supreme ego, 100%. So God is only thinking about himself, not about you. God is not even in awareness of himself. So you are blindly following. God cannot exist this existence. He has to stay in a dream. And this is why he does not want the self to wake up. When the self wakes up, God goes into extinction. So believe and trust in some things outside of yourself. Believe and trust in some beings called gods with different names. They're playing the same roles of putting you in hell if you don't give them your soul. That you must give them your soul to partake in their heaven. It's an illusion. Do you know what is heaven and what is hell? We live in a duality world. So there's the visible world where we need a body to explore. And then there's the invisible world where you go in it when you sleep. You have to go in there in a dream because this world is a dream. You go in the invisible world, you do not need a body. You're projecting yourself in there. You don't need a body in the invisible world. So in the invisible world, the gods have created heaven and hell. So if you give them your soul and you become their friends and they can use you to do what they want, they don't torture you. If you fight against them and tell them that you're not going to give them your soul, then they put you in hell and traumatize you. This is the trickery that they've been doing, enslaving the self for ages. When I'm faced with the gods, they don't want you to think for yourself. They want to control your mind and tell you what to think and tell you how to be. That this doesn't make any sense. That God wants you to be his slave, his whore, his recruiter for more souls. And they always campaigning with violence and treatment of punishment when you stand your ground against them. Yeah, because I have stood my ground against the gods. They've been putting their magnetic energy, but they cannot win. They're being defeated by the self because this duality world must end because what? The self has to wake up. The gods can only exist if the self sleeps. When you wake up, you extinguish God because God is the ego that rises out of the mind because the self sleeps. It trance the self in the dream. So let's look again at what is fear. Fear stems from ignorance. You don't know the truth of the world. False self-identification, right? You don't know yourself. Imagination and illusion. When you are using imagination, because sometimes you're seeing something that is not there, and so you're creating your fears. So how do I face my fears? And what is the ego's fears versus the real self, the soul fears? Who is it that is having this fear and why? The ego does not want to give up this dream world. The ego does not know how to play fear. It is all about its desires and attachment and fulfilling all of its habits. Is there a need to your fear? No, there is no need to fear. Your real and true self is longing to be free from the bondage of this world where it exists, sleeping and being enslaved by consciousness. This self never gets to explore the world. Only the ego does. Only the ego is exploring the world. It has enslaved and veiled and entranced the self in a dream. It does not want the self to wake up. And so it is the only one that is exploring and partaking of the world. So tell me now, be honest with me. Is it fear that the self never gets to explore the world it has created? This is the reason that you must castrate this ego. This ego is the false character. It is a dream character. It is a false self. The ego is not yourself. You have been mistaking the ego for yourself. You have been mistaking the body for yourself. This is a dream character. This dream character, the ego, has to go so that your real and true self can wake up. What ignorance are you holding to that is at the root of your fear? When I tell you that this world is coming to an end, when I tell you that it's time to evolve yourself, what ignorance is at the root of your fear? Why are you fearing this? Who is the one that is fearing? It's the ego, it's not the self. So, how can I face my fear? How can you face your fears? Because I had to face my fears. I had to face all of the gods. And I have been facing all of the gods by myself. And everyone is telling me, I am too afraid. If you face your fears, you will see, and when you look in the mirror, you will see yourself, that it is you. You are afraid of your dark nature. That's yourself that you are afraid of. Yourself that has been exploring the world in ignorance. The fear of the ego versus the fear of the self. So what does the ego fear? The ego has fear of death, the fear of losing power over the self, and fear of losing its desires and attachments. These are the fears of the ego. These are not the fears of the self. The fears of the egos are the fear of balance. The ego does not want this world to come into balance. The ego loves chaos, and the ego is afraid of truth. The ego does not want to know truth. What are the fears of the self? The self is afraid of the duality, because in duality, the self has to go to sleep, and the self is in an awareness of itself, and through that, it's afraid that it get enslaved inside of the dream, and it wants to wake up, and it's afraid that it will get lost sleeping inside the dream and not get to be awakened. For ages, the self has been sleeping. The ego has locked it, consciousness has transit and enslaved it inside of the dream. For ages, the self has been terrified. The self has been afraid of obscurity of its sun. It wants its light to shine. And when it goes into the duality, the self has to turn its light off. And so the self is afraid of that. What is the fear of the self? The worst fear of the self are the fear of the gods, the fear of consciousness, tyrannical rulership, and enslavement. Consciousness takes the self and it enslaves it within itself. For ages, it's been doing this, enslaving the self, swallowing the self within itself, enslaving it, and the self has needs its liberation and its freedom. And this is terrifying for the self. And so this is what the fear the self of. This is why the self wants to awake from the dream, but the ego does not want it to awake, because once the self awakes, this world have to be extinguished, and the ego does not want that. So it's time to face your fears. Who is it that is afraid? You have to ask a question. Who is it that is afraid? What is the real fear? Right? The real fear is that the self is enslaved and trapped in the dream of the consciousness, the ego, the supreme ego. The self is terrified of the gods. It's terrified of the consciousness. It's time to face your dark nature, to illuminate them. And these dark natures, who are they? They are the gods. They are yourself exploring the world, disembodied as the supreme ego. The gods have planted fear within you so they can always control you and keep you in bondage. You must face your fears to demolish them. Go to the root and uproot your fears. Yes, I castrate this ego for my real self liberation. I am free. So you must do that. Are you ready to face your fears? I am victorious. I am triumphant. And fear has no power over me. I say fear has no power over me. Fear is imagination, ignorance, and illusion. Fear is imagination, ignorance, and illusion. I realize that the world in which I live has not been projected onto me, but by me. I realize that all comes from within. I realize fear must come to an end. I realize fear must come to an end. Everything I have created, I demolish. Everything that I have created, I demolish. I return to my ultimate true state. I return to my ultimate true state. You made an appearance, no make a disappearance. I am free. I am free. I am free from my imaginary bondage. I return to my ultimate true state. I return to my ultimate true state. I dissolve all demons and monsters of my own making and creation. I dissolve all demons and monsters of my own creation. I dissolve all demons and monsters of my own creation and making. The entire universe is my body. I have no need to fear. You are myself and timeless with me. You are myself and timeless with me. I demolish you. All is myself and I alone exist. All is myself and I alone exist. All is a figment of my imagination. And everything that I have created, I demolish. Everything that I have created, I demolish. I return to my ultimate true state. I return to my ultimate true state. I am free. I am free. I am free from my imaginary bondage. I am free from my imaginary bondage.